Welcome back, everybody. Again, this is Anthony Mitchell, host of the End Zone Club podcast, where, as always, we have conversations that are designed to push you from walking in potential to actually fulfilling your purpose. And today, it brings me great joy to let you know that I have a special guest in the building. So it won't just be my voice you'll be hearing from today, but I'll let him introduce himself.
All right. I am Jonathan Kutz. I am the host of the podcast Food for Thought, where we kind of just cover different topics every week, and I give you some food for thought, hopefully something that makes you think.
With that said, we have crossed paths via social media, and I love his platform for being just a host of political and godly and a smorgasbord of many other things. But it's a go-to place if you're interested in any of those things. But before I dig too deeply in the introduction, Jonathan, kind of take us on a quick journey through some places you've been, because you got a pretty interesting background. Kind of take us through that journey and lead us up to this point we are now.
Absolutely. So I am a college student, and my dad is a professor. And so I have had the absolute privilege of living in three different countries and traveling to, I think now I'm close to 10 or 11. I lived in Africa for a couple of months, for a little bit longer than a semester, I should say. And I've lived in Australia, but I've also traveled to Mexico. I've traveled to Guatemala to do missions trips, and that was all before the age of, I'd say, 16. And then when I got back to the U.S. from Australia, I started college, and that's where I'm at now. And that's kind of my time in college has been what has motivated me to start this podcast, mainly because, well, I've been a little bit disappointed with the college experience, I should say, and the things that I've been taught, and the professors there have shown me that it's kind of important to learn about critical thinking, which was kind of the motivation to start my podcast, I would say.
Stupid question, but are you fluent in any other languages?
I am not, no, but that's not a stupid question, though. That's fair. I am not fluent in either language. I know a little tiny bit of French, and I'm actually taking a French class this semester, so maybe we'll get better. But that's something I would love to do, is become more fluent in other languages, but I'm not yet.
So, of all the places you've been, where has been your favorite location?
Okay, my favorite location, probably one of two, either New Zealand or the U.S.'s own Maine. Maine is absolutely beautiful, but I am also a huge nerd, and so New Zealand is where they filmed The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and we got to see a bunch of all the different locations there. So New Zealand is absolutely gorgeous as well.
And I think it's usually the beautiful places we've been that stand out the most. But one thing I
Hmm.
always like to hear from point of view perspective is people who have been other places coming back to America. Is there like a moment where you realize worldview kind of shaped the way you
Oh
see
yeah.
things differently? Do you have any of those experiences?
Absolutely. Coming back to America from Africa was visceral. Same thing, I would say more so from Guatemala, because I went to Guatemala just last summer. And coming back from Guatemala was absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy. But coming back from Africa was also visceral because we were there for such a long time. But yeah, coming back and seeing the sheer level of fortune that we have here in America, the ability to just make phone calls easily without the hassle. One of the funniest things is in Africa, if you even go to like a fast food restaurant, because they do have a couple of those, you're still waiting 3 hours. Just that's like a fat, like people don't go out to eat in Africa, and when you do, it's not a quick experience. It's all day. So we'd bring games with us, and we would go out for the day to try a restaurant when we went to Africa. But then even we were in Kigali, which was the capital, and even the level of technological advancement that we have in America versus there is rather insane. And so it's 100% shaped the way that I perceive America and like just the sheer level of blessings that we have in this country.
Do you find it hard sometimes, again, with what you just shared, being able to sometimes converse with others as it pertains to your worldview and sometimes people that maybe haven't gotten out as much? How do you fit in that bracket of being able to really interject where you guys have a
Mm.
commonality in language?
So conversing with other people is one of my favorite things to do. And when you have um when you have been to these other countries, trying to share your perspective is extremely important.
We're
And
freezing again.
um it's difficult to do it with poise and with grace, which is what I think is important to do, is sharing the things that I have learned in a very humble way, because I'm only 19, and so um, being able to do it with a certain level of tact, I think, is an extremely important thing. And it is difficult a lot of times trying to offer a perspective that is so foreign to a lot of people, which is why I think it's extremely important that I do so after consulting the Holy Spirit and really reflecting on my perspective and the fact that, does this actually need to be shared, and is this going to be, Paul talks about sharing only what is good for the edification of others. And so is it going to be edifying? Because it's easy for me to say, like, well, you don't really know what you're talking about because you've never left the United States. Some people have never left their city. And so trying to bring in this perspective of, well, I've been all over the world, it's very easy to get caught up in talking as like a superior individual because I've traveled so much, and that's very clearly not the case. I don't know a whole lot about anything. I know about some things, but trying to share that perspective is hard, because it's hard for people to even relate to living in Africa, let alone leaving their cities or their states.
I know sometimes when we haven't been places and we haven't experienced culture, sometimes the first thing we tend to do is we look at other cultures as being different. Um,
Mm-hmm.
my mother's from Jamaica, and there's a
Mm-hmm.
split restaurant here in one of the local cities that does Jamaican slash African cuisine. And I had never had African cuisine, and they introduced me to peanut butter chicken. I don't know if that's something you've ever tried while you were there in Africa,
That is not.
but it didn't sound like something I was interested in. So I was kind of standoffish, and the guy got
Yeah.
offended because
Oh,
I guess
sure.
my whole expression wasn't very conducive to me being nice. So
Mm-hmm.
he kind of implored me not to be like that. And I tried the food, and actually I found out I really loved it. And I have since developed that as one of my favorite dishes. So with you being a well-traveled
Mm.
guy, you've seen a lot of things. Where do you stand? I know with your podcast you do a lot politically. Like, what about your journey developed that taste in life and just the whole way that everything works?
So you're asking about my how I developed my political bent, essentially.
Yes.
Okay. So obviously it's a lot of it is from my religious beliefs, from being a Christian. Um, I would say that is probably 70% of where my politics is now comes from my Christianity, maybe 60%. Um, because because I have family members that go to my same church and are far more democratic than I am, and I don't. I try not to like villainize is one of the most important things, because I think politics are important, but the kingdom of God is more important in being cohesive. I think we talked about this a little bit on Friday. But so I would say my Christianity, but the biggest thing I think has to be, or one of the biggest things has to be, my dad. And my whole life we've been raised up. The most important thing instilled in us is critical thinking skills. My dad has books dedicated to that. Like I said, my dad's a professor, and so he teaches research methods classes, and he's written a book that's about critical thinking skills. And I adopted that belief very it's very I dedicated myself to that a lot, is the value and importance of simply critically thinking. And I think that is one of the things that made me fall into this conservative bent of mine, is just observations of the world and rationalizing out these different positions and adopting the one that makes more sense to me. And that's one of the things I think that has led me along this path. And that's one of the things that also um, led me towards the podcast that I have, is presenting these historical situations or these different philosophies and kind of rationalizing them out in the context of the Bible. Because that's the most important thing. You can be as rational as you want, but rationality has to be subservient to something higher and greater. Because we are, C.S. Lewis has a great quote that I love, and I think I've used it twice now, is if we don't believe that we were created and our rationality was created by God, then we don't really know what our rationality is for. And it wasn't actually developed for rational thought. And that's a paraphrasing. But so if we don't believe that we were created by God and our minds weren't created by God for the purpose of thinking and rationalizing, then our rationale is kind of pointless. And so taking that approach is kind of led me towards critical thinking and how I believe, because there's a lot of policies that are presented by both sides of the political aisle, and some of them are very contradictory towards what the Bible tells us how we should behave. And if it's not going to agree with the Bible, then I'm not going to agree with that.
I kind of want to stay right in this vein because earlier
Sure.
you pointed out something that I myself have talked about often, even on this platform, and you talked about just the dichotomy of having even people that are one in your family, two in your church, who politically think a little differently than yourself. With that said,
Hmm.
how
Yeah.
do we, in today's society, when everybody's yelling at each other, how do we adapt a world Christian view where we are able to really have the heart of God and be able to speak to issues, but not, as
Mm.
you said, villainize the people?
That's a great question, and one that I struggle with myself. Um, I think it is the philosophy of you love the sinner and you hate the sin, and you have to disassociate those two things when, especially when you're talking with family members. When my family, fortunately, most of my family has the same sort of philosophical concepts, but we have one of our family members that has their own family that are could not be more opposite. And when we get together, we just remember and you focus on the things where you do align. So you want to focus on those things because you want to get to their intentions. And I think most people, when it comes down to it, have good intentions. There's very few people in this world that have expressly malicious intentions. And so when we can focus on the person's intentions and from there we can grow a relationship that might not be bound up in the politics, because politics are very hostile by nature. And so when we focus on the things that we do agree with first and foremost, and then we focus on people's intentions, then we can get a relationship, and it doesn't have to be as hostile. Things will become hostile when you talk about policy and implementation of those sorts of things, just because they're so opposite in a lot of ways, or yeah, because they're so opposite in a lot of ways. So things will get hostile, but when you have this baseline that's not rooted in politics and that's not rooted in those sorts of controversial and hostile things, it's far more easier to have a good, honest, and open discussion about those sorts of things.
And I think open discussions and conversations are probably more and more not happening because I think because of our own cognitive blindness
Absolutely.
to whatever I have an affinity for, you have an affinity, I feel like I am always right.
Hmm.
Is there a is there a
Oh
point in
yeah.
time when we as believers should look in the mirror and make sure that we, whatever we're standing for, whatever we're professing to be about, does there come a point in time where we have to make sure that we're on the right side of God's way, or is that just something that we are supposed to just align with a political party and assume that that's God's party and that's what we stand for? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, oh yeah. We should never just assume that God is a Republican or God is a Democrat. God is neither. God is concerned with his kingdom. That's why Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God what is God's." That's kind of it's an admonishment of saying that God is a political party. He's definitely not. And if we, I wrote an article that I don't know if I'm going to publish it or not. I've tried sent it a couple places, but I might try a little bit harder. But about the subscriptionization of philosophy. And so many people simply subscribe to a philosophy, and it goes back to critical thinking. They never think about anything. I'm a member of the Daily Wire, and I like a lot of what they say. I listen to a lot of politically bent podcasts, but never do I wholeheartedly agree with every single thing that one of the pundits say. And I don't think we should. If you can't come up with an original thought on a subject, I think that's dangerous. And a lot of people don't have time to just spend hours philosophizing about these sorts of things, and that's fine. But so it's good to get information from these things. But what is bad is when you find yourself agreeing with every single thing that somebody says. Because we are all beautifully and wonderfully made. We're all created by a creator and given different ideas about things. And you might agree with a whole lot of what somebody says, but if you never take the time to rationalize one of your thoughts on these issues and on these subjects, I think that's incredibly dangerous because then you're not spending time figuring out why you believe what you believe. And if you can't do that, then you can't have a productive and open conversation with somebody, with even somebody who agrees with you on a certain issue. If you don't have original thoughts on things, it's very dangerous when you begin to discuss ideas, because that's what leads to these ideologies that we find so common everywhere amongst political conversations, which is just people who are doubling down on something because they don't truly know why they believe it, but they feel attached to that concept or idea.
So I'm going to rewind this conversation back even a little more because, again,
Okay.
you keep bringing up very good nuggets as you're explaining your points. And you just talked about sometimes people don't know why they believe what they believe. Well, I do know in some circles, some
Yeah.
communities, people are taught how to think, how to believe. But what I want to do, I want to take all this, put it in the bag, shake it up, drop it on the ground. And I want you, just from your experience and your knowledge, talk to us first of all about what the purpose for politics really even is.
That's a great question. So the purpose of politics is, in essence, to have dialogues and discussions about the governance of a nation. So, as we understand it, politics is any discussion between two different concepts and ideas about how a nation should be governed. That's essentially the definition of politics. Um, and those are important because, as I just stated, people have different ideas about how a nation should be governed. And so politics is simply nothing more than the discussion of those different ideas. We know in systems of governance, there's pretty much three or possibly four. One of them is a monarchy. Others are democracies and republics, which are two different things that are often confused. But you essentially have state control of something, which is socialism or communism, and then you have um, those are also economic theories as well, but that's different. But you have these socialism, communism, then you have monarchy, and then you have what is a democracy, or what we are in America is a democratic republic. And so there's many different systems of governance, and politics is the debate between those systems of governance as to which is the most effective or which one the people want. When you have something like a monarchy, though, they typically don't care what the people want. That's why we decided to make our own thing here in America in 1776. But that's what politics is: the discussion of the philosophical concepts about how a nation should be governed.
Thank you for that understanding because I think a lot of times, anytime as it pertains to us, when we talk politics, people just tend to think it's two sides arguing, but there's a common goal actually from what you just had given us that says it's about what's best for governing this nation. Now, I do hear a lot because,
Hmm.
of course, it's that time of the year where
If I
we're at
can, for one
midterms. And
second, if I can for 1 second, just add something. I
okay, go
think
ahead.
one of the reasons we have difficulty with politics is because politics have become so cultural, and people like the culture has kind of adopted, and so it's hard to distinguish between the two of them. And because they are this confrontational thing, people have a hard time separating cultural conversations from political conversations, which is another thing that just builds tension around this. But just wanted to add that there.
That's a good addition. It's a good addition. Do you feel like, from a godly perspective, that we in this nation are headed in a way that's going to bring God glory and bring him great joy?
Hmm.
And I want you to think
That's a
about
good
that because with
question.
you being a historical buff like you are, one thing Winston Churchill said is as far back as you can see in the past is as far as you can see in the future. And history has a direct narrative
Absolutely.
of being very cyclical, meaning that we will
Hmm.
see a lot of trends in every
Hmm.
society or superpower that rises and that falls. Are we headed in the right direction, or have we ever seen anything like what we see now in history?
So absolutely, we have seen this before in history. We see this all over in history. Um, I don't want to talk about that because then it'll get very gloomy and doomy unless you want me to talk about that.
Okay, okay.
But yeah, we've seen this before. If you actually look, I'll just say this real quick, and then I'll answer the other part of your question. Um, if you chronicle through the time of the Romans, our trajectory matches almost point for point. So we even because we had the monarchy, and then they overthrew their monarch, and then started the republic, and then the republic turned more into a democracy, and then it turned into a tyranny, and then it collapsed essentially, and that's over a much longer period of time. It was over 1,000 years or so. But yeah, our trajectory aligns almost exactly with that of Rome's. Doesn't mean we'll have the same outcome necessarily, but it aligns almost verbatim. And so yeah, we've seen this before, um, and I think that's why it's important that we talk about history, which is one of the reasons I talk about history a lot on my podcast, because people don't really look much farther back in time than World War II, which is unfortunate because there's a lot of beautiful history in the past that's good for the edification. But as for, will we are we headed towards something that will glorify God? Well, God will always be glorified, I think. So and we have the verse, I forget in which book, but God works out all things for the good of those who diligently seek after him and are called according to his purposes. And so, as long as we're called according to God's purposes, we will act out his will, and God's will is to be glorified in some sense. His will is much more complicated than that, obviously. But I think looking at historical trends, we also see, I think we're all on the cusp of a revival. Um, but in the end, God will be glorified. And we are, of course, traveling just second by second, minute by minute, hour by hour, closer towards the end. So in the end, God will always stand to be glorified because he is God. And so, yeah, I think we are headed that way. But I think we will get to a point where we will only be able to kind of revitalize our society, our nation, through the glorification of God and through the revival of the church. So I think just by nature of, I mean, we have the Bible here. We know, we've read Revelations. God will be glorified no matter what, and there isn't much that we can do about that, I don't think. So I hope that
I
answered your
think it's
question.
important to know that regardless of what we are part of, history does play an important matter. And I think knowing history, when you're having these sorts of conversations, my desire is not to speak doom and gloom or anything crazy, but to provide kids with just a
Hmm.
narrative that it's okay to study history, know where you play a part at, and to do your part and to ensuring the best outcome in your home, your
Oh yeah.
community, whatever you're a part of. It does take their involvement. And speaking of involvement, I want to segue into your podcast. If you don't mind, let's talk a little bit about your
Okay.
podcast for those who are listening to all of these nuggets of wisdom that
Sure.
you have dropped today and that want to hear more and want to support what you got going on. Tell us more about where we can support you, where we can hear, and what we'll be expecting to receive just within supporting your platform.
Sure. So, my podcast is called the Food for Thought Podcast, and it's available anywhere you get podcasts. And the premise of the show is essentially I'm trying to provide you with food for thought. So, my most recent episode is on the multiverse, which is very different than my episode that I've done on the Cold War or episodes I've done on ancient philosophy, such as Stoicism, such as Epicureanism. So I might at some point try to narrow down the topics, but I don't see a reason to do that because I'm interested in a lot of different things. And if you folks are interested in a lot of different things, whether it be history, mathematics, I've talked about game theory, and I've talked about the scientific branch of chaos and all these different things. And then I try to provide a reason on why you should be interested in these things and why you should apply these things into your lives, how we can find God through these things, which I think is very important, and how these can be practically applied in your life. So I try to find these abstract concepts and give you a reason why you should care about it and why it actually does affect your day to day life.
Before we go, there's one question that I always ask my guests. It's the $1 million question, and I like to throw it as a curveball. So, are you ready for the $1 million question?
Okay. Sure. As ready as I'll ever be.
You said it apprehensively. It's nothing that's going to get either you or I canceled, but the question goes something like this.
All right.
Knowing now what you've known, and that's through what you've gathered through life, your experiences, your wisdom, what is one thing you knew now that you wish you knew when you were younger?
Hmm. Wow. Um. Hmm. That's a great question. Um. God is in fact in the Bible, and he does in fact have a personality that you can find. When I was young, I hated reading, and I didn't like reading the Bible because I thought it was boring. So, but you can in fact find God's personality through reading, especially the Bible, but through reading in general. I have a philosophy about stories, and that we don't have to get into because I know we're going to close soon. But read and read the Bible a lot more, and that'll set you up pretty well, I think. But yeah, read the Bible because you can actually find God in it.
With that said, I have to thank you for your time, your energy, your wisdom. I have enjoyed this bit of conversation, and we will have to link up again in the near present because just to
Absolutely.
hear, I'm a sponge when I hear people that are passionate about what they're talking about, but most importantly, they know what they're talking about. I really love those conversations. So before we get off of here, is there anything else
It
you
was
want to share with
absolutely
the
a
crowd
pleasure for
before we
me too.
disappear?
Um, no, I just reiterate my last point. Read the Bible, but also read other books too. So that's the only thing. That's the biggest thing that I tell people. If they ever, very few people ask me those kinds of questions, but when they do ask me, read as much as you can all the time.
There you go, guys. Please go over to his podcast, Food for Thought. Don't just listen, but please like, share, subscribe, rate, comment, give them all thumbs up. By doing so, you will expose a greater crowd to the content that he is pushing, which ultimately is for God's glory. With that said, this is the End Zone Club. Until next time, be blessed.
Awesome.